Okay, let's dive in. What if? What if everything we sort of assume about crime, about who's a criminal, how we deal with it, what if it's just wrong? Or at least missing a huge piece of the puzzle?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating, almost radical way to look at it. We're exploring the thinking of Jacque Fresco today, specifically from an article he wrote called "What Are You Going to Do with the Criminals?"
Yeah.
He was a social engineer, a futurist.
Exactly. And he doesn't just suggest, tweaking things. He really questions the whole foundation. Forget prison reform for a second. He's asking why people commit crimes in the first place. His argument is basically that it's not like some built-in flaw in people.
That's his central point.
Yeah.
Criminality, as we define it, isn't innate. It's largely a product of our environment, our circumstances. Especially, he stresses, the economic ones. It's quite a deterministic viewpoint, suggesting our conditions really shape our actions, maybe more than we usually think.
He uses this analogy that really stuck with me. Crime is like pollution.
Oh, right.
You know how industry creates pollution as a sort of side effect, a byproduct?
Yeah.
Fresco says crime is like that. It's a byproduct of, well, social inequality, systemic problems. It kind of shifts the blame, doesn't it?
It really does. It moves the focus from just, the individual who did something wrong
Yeah.
to the whole societal structure that might have pushed them towards it. What pressures were they under? What opportunities did they not have?
And a huge factor there, Fresco argues, is economic disadvantage, poverty, constant instability. He suggests that can create situations where, well, people feel they don't have other options. Crime becomes almost a survival strategy for some.
And that leads him to this interesting distinction he makes between people who climb out of poverty, honestly, and those who get wealthy, but then continue to exploit others.
Right. Why would they do that?
Well, he suggests it might be a kind of overcompensation, a behavior learned from those early experiences of deprivation, of maybe being exploited themselves. So when they get power, they kind of repeat the pattern, unfortunately.
And it's not just about lacking money, is it? Fresco also kind of points a finger at our culture. How sometimes we seem to almost admire a certain ruthlessness when it comes to getting ahead.
Yeah, he brings up those old sayings like, a sucker is born every minute.
Or a fool and his money are soon parted.
Yeah, exactly. And his point is that these phrases, even if we say them jokingly, they reveal this sort of cynical cultural acceptance of deception, especially in money matters.
So if we kind of accept that taking advantage of people is just smart business or how things are,
Then it makes it easier to blur the lines, ethically speaking. It can subtly normalize behavior that, well, maybe isn't actually okay. It becomes part of the economic game.
Okay, so moving on. Here's where Fresco gets really provocative, I think. He tackles the idea of justice itself. He argues it's not some fundamental law of the universe like gravity or something. It's a human invention.
Right. He traces its roots back to, religion, subjective morality, our own ideas of right and wrong, which aren't always objective.
He gives an example, like if someone dies accidentally, say in a car crash, we see it as a tragedy, sure, but we don't automatically think someone needs to be punished in a moral sense.
Unless, as he points out, you bring in a concept like karma, then suddenly there's this idea of cosmic payback.
Yeah, exactly. And he stresses how much our ideas of justice change. They vary wildly depending on where you are, when you lived. What's considered just punishment now might have been barbaric then, or vice versa.
Which really highlights the lack of a single universal standard. It proves his point, really, that justice is something we've constructed. It's malleable.
And if justice is a construct, then what about the laws that are supposed to uphold it? He gets pretty critical there, too.
Oh, definitely. Fresco sees laws less as these impartial rules for everyone's good, and more as, well, tools. Tools developed by those with power, the elite, as he calls them, mainly to protect their own interests, their property, their position.
He takes that famous commandment, thou shalt not steal. Seems straightforward, right?
I think so.
But Fresco argues, historically, its main job was protecting the stuff owned by the wealthy. It wasn't necessarily focused on, say, someone starving taking food to survive.
And he implies that same thinking to modern stuff, like banking, charging interest, for instance.
Okay.
His argument isn't really about whether interest is inherently good or bad. It's that it's legal because the people and institutions with financial power created the system that makes it legal and profitable for them. So the law doesn't always map perfectly onto some universal ethical principle, in his view.
It keeps coming back to this idea that morality itself isn't fixed, doesn't it?
Exactly. Fresco points out how norms shift dramatically Think about practices that were once totally accepted, even prestigious in some societies.
Like what?
Well, he mentions polygamy for rulers, for kings. In many places and times, that was perfectly normal, even religiously sanctioned. Now, in many cultures, it's seen as immoral or illegal.
Right. So what's moral or just or even legal isn't set in stone.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's flexible. It changes. And crucially, Fresco argues it's heavily influenced by whoever holds the power in that society at that time. They get to shape the definitions, to a large extent.
So if we pull all this together, what's the big takeaway from Fresco's article? It feels like a huge challenge to how we run things.
It absolutely is. The core implication is we need to fundamentally rethink our approach to crime and justice. If behavior we call criminal is often a symptom of deeper social and economic problems.
Then just punishing people after the fact isn't really solving anything, is it? It's like treating the symptom, not the cause.
That's exactly Fresco's point. He calls for a massive shift, less focus on reaction and punishment, more focus on proactively addressing the root causes, the poverty, the inequality, the lack of opportunity, the things that create the conditions where crime might seem like a viable option.
So stop just reacting. Start designing. Designing a society that prevents crime.
Yeah, that's his vision. Designing a society where basic needs are met, where opportunities are fair, where those systemic problems that breed desperation are actually tackled and ideally eliminated.
Wow. Okay, so that leaves a really big question hanging there for you, the listener, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Building on Fresco's ideas, could we actually change our social and economic structures so fundamentally that the need for crime, or at least much of it, just disappears? And what would that society even look like?
It's a radical thought, definitely provocative, but Fresco's work pushes us to ask those kinds of questions.
It really does. And if you want to explore his arguments in more detail, get deeper into his perspective, we'll put a link to the full article. It's available via YouTube in our show notes. It's definitely thinking that pushes back against a lot of standard assumptions about crime, justice, and how our world works.